The night did not end when the final out was recorded. That is the part that matters. Because when the scoreboard went dark and the stadium lights dimmed and the last of the crowd filtered out into the Philadelphia streets, something was already happening inside the Phillies clubhouse that had nothing to do with baseball. Something that had been building for weeks. Something that, once it finally broke open completely. By midnight, 2 players were gone. By morning, the manager's office was empty. And somewhere in between, Shohei Ohtani's name had been used in a way that nobody in that building will be allowed to forget for a very long time. It started with the loss. Not just a loss in the standing sense. Not just another entry in the defeat column that every team accumulates over the course of a long season. This was the kind of loss that exposes something. The kind that pulls back the curtain on a team that has been pretending, even to itself, that everything is fine. That the chemistry is intact. That the roster is built correctly. That the people in charge know what they are doing. The Dodgers had just walked out of Citizens Bank Park with a win. The final score was not the conversation. The conversation was everything that happened after the handshakes. Everything that happened when the doors closed and the cameras stopped rolling and the only people left in the room were the ones who had to live with what this season was becoming. That is when it started. The designated for assignment decisions did not come from nowhere. That is the first thing to understand about what the Phillies did in the hours following the loss. A DFA is never spontaneous. It is never an emotional reaction, no matter how emotional the moment feels. It is a decision that requires paperwork and roster moves and conversations between the front office and the field staff and at least 3 people who have to agree that this is the right direction. The fact that 2 players were DFA'd on the same night means the conversation had already happened. Multiple times. In multiple rooms. The loss had not created the problem. The loss had simply made it impossible to delay the solution any longer. The 2 players were informed separately. One found out from the manager directly, in the office, before the manager himself knew what the next 12 hours would bring. The other found out from a front office representative who came down from the executive level specifically for that conversation. Both were described by people inside the organization as key contributors. That word, key, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Because key contributors do not get designated for assignment unless something has gone wrong that statistics alone cannot explain. The clubhouse felt it immediately. One veteran player, speaking without his name attached, described the atmosphere in the room after the news spread. It was like the air changed. You could feel it. When guys you've been playing next to all season are suddenly not there anymore, it changes something. It makes everything feel less stable. Less stable. That phrase would prove to be more accurate than anyone in that room realized. The confrontation involving Otani did not happen in the clubhouse. It happened on the field. In full view of the umpires, the opposing dugout, and whatever cameras were positioned at the right angle to catch it. And the fact that it happened in public, in that setting, with those witnesses, is what transformed it from an incident into a story that the league could not look away from. The pitcher initiated it. He had been visibly frustrated for several innings. The kind of frustration that starts in the legs, the way a pitcher shifts his weight between pitches when the game is not going the way he planned, and works its way up through the shoulders and into the jaw. The body language had been readable from the third base line. But body language is not a penalty. Body language is just weather. What he said was different. The words were directed at Otani during an at-bat. Not in the ambient noise of competition, not in the general language of intensity that happens between pitcher and hitter in every game across the major leagues. These were specific words. Pointed words. Words that the first base umpire heard clearly enough to step forward immediately. The first baseman then entered the conversation from his position. That is the detail that escalated everything. Because a first baseman inserting himself into an exchange between a pitcher and a hitter, doing so verbally and with the kind of language that was being used in that moment, is not competitive fire. It is a different category of behavior entirely. The umpires did not hesitate. The penalties came swiftly and without the kind of extended argument that sometimes softens these moments into theater. There was no long back and forth. There was no meeting at home plate where everyone talks loudly and then walks away. The umpires assessed what had happened, identified the parties involved, and issued the consequences. Both the pitcher and the first baseman were ejected. The penalties beyond the game, the fines and suspensions that would follow through the league office's review process, were not yet formalized that evening. But everyone in the stadium understood that the ejection was not the end of the consequences. It was the beginning of them. Otani did not respond in the way the pitcher and first baseman may have expected. He did not gesture. He did not shout. He did not turn to the dugout with an expression that invited his teammates to escalate the situation. He stood in the batter's box while the umpires handled what needed to be handled, and when the situation was resolved, he returned his attention to the at-bat as though the interruption had been a mound visit and nothing more. That composure is worth examining. Not because it is surprising, because by now the baseball world has come to expect a certain stillness from Otani in moments of pressure. But because of what it communicated to everyone watching. The pitcher had said something intended to destabilize. The first baseman had amplified it. And Otani had simply waited for the noise to finish. A member of the Dodgers organization, speaking after the game, chose not to characterize what had been said. But they did say this. He's not someone who needs to win that kind of moment. He already knows who he is. That's a hard thing to rattle. The brawl happened later. Not between the Dodgers and the Phillies. Not between players from opposing teams who had allowed the tension of competition to cross a line. The brawl happened inside the Phillies organization itself. That distinction is everything. Because a fight between two teams is a story about rivalry. A fight inside one team is a story about collapse. The details of what exactly transpired in the Phillies clubhouse in the hour after the game are incomplete. The accounts that have emerged are consistent in their broad shape but differ in their specific sequence. What is agreed upon is that voices were raised. That the argument moved from words to something physical. That multiple players were involved and that the coaching staff had to intervene before the situation resolved itself. One person with direct knowledge of what occurred described it carefully. It wasn't one thing. It was everything at once. The DFAs, the ejections, the loss, the whole night. It came out in that room. That phrase, "it came out," is the most honest way to describe what happened. Pressure that accumulates does not disappear when the game ends. It finds a room. It finds a moment. And on this particular night, it found both. The manager was fired before sunrise. That timeline is important. Not because of the hour, but because of what it means. A decision made before sunrise is not a decision that was made that night. It is a decision that was made weeks ago, perhaps months ago, and was finally carried out under the cover of a night when everything else had already fallen apart anyway. The manager had been given repeated opportunities to stabilize a roster that was fracturing. He had been given conversations and adjustments and the kind of quiet organizational support that front offices provide when they are not yet ready to act but are already preparing to. He had been told, in the language that organizations use when they want to communicate urgency without accountability, that things needed to change. Things had not changed. The loss, the DFAs, the on-field misconduct, the internal brawl. Any one of those elements in isolation might have been survivable. Together, on the same night, they composed a picture that the Phillies front office looked at and decided they could no longer explain away. His exit from the building was quiet. There was no dramatic scene. No final speech in the clubhouse, no gathering of players in a circle to hear parting words. He left the way managers sometimes leave when the decision is final and the organization wants the transition to begin immediately. Quickly. Without ceremony. The players found out the next morning. Several of them had not slept. Some were still processing the events of the night before. When the news of the firing reached the clubhouse, the room did not erupt. It did not go silent either. It sat somewhere in between, in that particular register of exhaustion that follows a night when too many things have happened too quickly to absorb any single one of them fully. What the Phillies are left with now is a question that no trade can immediately answer and no managerial hire can instantly solve. They are left with the question of what this team actually is. Not on paper. Not in the projections that were written about them before the season began. But in reality. In the room. In the moments when the game is over and the decisions have been made and the only thing left is the truth of how a group of people behave when the pressure becomes too great to manage. 2 players designated. A manager fired. A brawl in the clubhouse. And in the middle of all of it, Shohei Ohtani, standing in the batter's box, absorbing whatever was said to him, and waiting quietly for the storm to pass. The Phillies are in the business of rebuilding something tonight. The question is whether the people left in that clubhouse have the capacity to build it, or whether the foundation cracked too deeply on a Tuesday night in Philadelphia when everything came apart at once. That question does not have an answer yet. But the silence in the manager's empty office this morning speaks to it more clearly than any press conference will. The chair is still there. Nobody is sitting in it.